You pour your heart into every project, show up early, stay late, and deliver exceptional work. Yet somehow you remain invisible when promotions are discussed. Every day you watch colleagues who seem to do less get the recognition, respect, and opportunities that should be yours, while your contributions go unnoticed and unappreciated. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying human nature and the art of winning friends and influencing people. Through my research and personal experience, I discovered that respect isn't earned through hard work alone. It's cultivated through specific principles of human relations that most people never learn. What I'm about to share will transform how others perceive and treat you, using the same techniques that helped millions of people command respect and influence in their personal and professional lives. These aren't just theories, they're proven strategies that have stood the test of time. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing insights, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see our global community of respect builders grow. I want you to know that I wasn't born with some natural gift for earning respect. In fact, quite the opposite. Growing up on our small farm in Maryville, Missouri, I was the awkward kid who struggled to fit in anywhere. My clothes were patched, my confidence was non-existent, and my classmates treated me like I was invisible or worse, like I was someone to be pitied. I remember one particular day when I was 12 years old. My teacher, Mrs. Henderson, handed back our arithmetic tests. Mine came back with a large red F scrawled across the top. But it wasn't the failing grade that crushed MIT, was what happened next. She held up my paper in front of the entire class and said, "This is what happens when you don't apply yourself, children." The snickers that followed felt like daggers. That night, I sat on our front porch with that crumpled test in my hands, feeling completely worthless. My father found me there and sat down beside me. He didn't say much, he wasn't a man of many words, but he looked at that paper and then at me and said something I'll never forget. "Son, grades measure what you know about arithmetic, but they don't measure what you're worth as a person." Those words planted a seed in my mind. I began to wonder, if grades didn't determine my worth, what did? Why did some people command respect, while others, like me, seemed destined to fade into the background? My first real breakthrough came during my sophomore year in high school when I joined the debate club. I was terrified to speak in public, my hands would shake, my voice would crack, and I was certain everyone could see right through my nervousness. But something magical happened during my third debate. I was arguing about the importance of rural education, a topic I genuinely cared about because of my own struggles. As I spoke about the challenges facing farm kids like myself, I noticed something different in the audience. They weren't laughing or looking bored. They were listening, really listening. For the first time in my life, I felt like what I had to say mattered to other people. After that debate, several classmates came up to me, kids who had never spoken to me before. They asked questions about my experiences and shared their own stories. I realized that by being genuine about my struggles, I had somehow earned their respect. It wasn't because I was the smartest or the most polished speaker. It was because I had connected with something real in their own experiences. That revelation changed everything for me. I began to study human nature with the same intensity that other students studied mathematics or history. I watched how people interacted, what made them respond positively to some individuals and not others. I started experimenting with different approaches in my own relationships. I discovered that the students who commanded the most respect weren't necessarily the most talented or attractive. They were the ones who made others feel important, who listened genuinely, and who showed sincere interest in their classmates' lives and concerns. This understanding became my mission. I realized that if an awkward farm boy like me could learn to earn respect and build meaningful relationships, then anyone could. The principles weren't mysterious or reserved for the naturally charismatic. They were learnable skills based on fundamental truths about human nature. That failing arithmetic test, which once seemed like such a devastating blow to my self-worth, had actually set me on the path to discovering something far more valuable than any grade, the timeless principles of human relations that would eventually help millions of people transform their lives and relationships. Through my years of studying human behavior and teaching thousands of people, I discovered one fundamental truth that governs all human relations. Every single person you meet is starving for genuine appreciation and recognition. This isn't just my opinion, it's the deepest psychological need that drives human behavior, more powerful than hunger for food or thirst for water. When I first began teaching public speaking courses in New York, I was amazed by the transformation I witnessed in my students. The shy accountant who could barely speak up in meetings became confident and respected. The struggling salesman who felt invisible to his colleagues started commanding attention and closing deals. What changed wasn't their technical skills or their intelligence, it was how they learned to satisfy this fundamental human hunger in others. Let me share with you the story of Charles Schwab, one of the most respected business leaders of his time. When I interviewed him for my research, he told me about a situation that perfectly illustrates this principle. He had a steel mill that was underperforming compared to other facilities. The day shift consistently produced less than the night shift, despite having the same equipment and similar workers. Instead of criticizing or threatening the day shift foreman, Schwab did something remarkable. At the end of the day shift, he walked through the mill and asked the foreman, "How many heats did your shift make today?" When the foreman replied 6, Schwab took a piece of chalk and wrote a large 6 on the floor where everyone could see it. When the night shift came in and saw the number, they asked what it meant. After learning it represented the day shift's production, they were determined to beat it. By morning, they had crossed out the 6 and written 7. When the day shift returned and saw this, their pride was aroused. They worked harder and wrote 10 by the end of their shift. Soon, both shifts were breaking production records. Schwab had tapped into their need for recognition and appreciation without saying a single critical word. He gave them something to be proud of, and they responded with extraordinary effort. This is profoundly different from flattery, which most people attempt and which always backfires. Flattery is insincere, selfish, and cheap. It's telling someone something you don't believe in order to get something you want. People can sense this insincerity immediately, and it destroys rather than builds respect. Genuine appreciation, on the other hand, comes from finding something you honestly admire about a person and expressing it sincerely. It's about recognizing the good that already exists in others and helping them see it themselves. I learned this lesson personally during my early teaching days. I had a student named Frank, a construction worker who seemed angry and defensive. In every class, other students avoided him, and I found myself dreading his participation. Instead of focusing on his abrasive manner, I forced myself to look for something genuine to appreciate. I noticed that despite his rough exterior, Frank always arrived exactly on time and never missed a class. During one session, I publicly acknowledged his perfect attendance and mentioned how it demonstrated real commitment to self-improvement. The change in Frank was immediate and remarkable. His defensive posture softened, and he began contributing positively to discussions. Later, Frank told me that no one had ever praised him for anything in his adult life. That simple recognition of his reliability transformed not just his behavior in class, but his entire approach to relationships. He became one of my most successful students and eventually started his own successful business. The key is to understand that every person has something admirable about them if you look hard enough. It might be their punctuality, their dedication to their family, their creativity, their persistence, or their kindness to others. When you learn to see these qualities and express genuine appreciation for them, you tap into the most powerful force in human relations. This principle works because it satisfies our deepest psychological need while simultaneously elevating the other person's self-image. When people feel genuinely appreciated, they naturally want to live up to that positive recognition. They begin to see themselves as someone worthy of respect, and they start behaving accordingly. Most people go through their entire lives feeling unappreciated and unrecognized. When you become someone who genuinely appreciates others, you become magnetic. People are drawn to you because you give them something they can't get anywhere else. The feeling that they matter, that they have value, that someone truly sees and appreciates who they are. I want to share with you a truth that revolutionized my understanding of human relations. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. This isn't just a pleasant sentiment. It's a fundamental law of human psychology that determines whether others will respect and follow you or dismiss and ignore you. Early in my career, I made the mistake that most people make. I thought the way to gain respect was to impress others with my knowledge, my achievements, and my opinions. I would dominate conversations, trying to prove how smart I was, how much I had accomplished, and why my ideas were superior. The result was predictable. People found me insufferable and avoided me whenever possible. The turning point came when I met Theodore Roosevelt at a dinner party in New York. I had prepared extensively, memorizing facts about politics and current events, hoping to impress the former president with my intellect. But Roosevelt did something that completely disarmed me. Instead of talking about himself or his accomplishments, he spent the entire evening asking me questions about my work, my background, and my interests. He wanted to know about my experiences teaching public speaking, what challenges I faced, and what I had learned about human nature. He listened with such genuine interest that I found myself sharing insights and stories I had never told anyone. By the end of the evening, I felt like the most fascinating person in the room, even though he had done most of the questioning and listening. Later, I realized what had happened. Roosevelt had made me feel important by showing sincere interest in my life and work. He understood that the quickest way to earn someone's respect and affection is to become genuinely interested in them as a person. This principle transformed my teaching and my personal relationships. Instead of trying to impress my students with my knowledge, I started each class by learning about them. I asked about their jobs, their families, their dreams, and their challenges. I discovered that the shy secretary had written poetry, the gruff businessman had a passion for gardening, and the nervous salesman was an expert on Civil War history. When I showed genuine interest in these aspects of their lives, something magical happened. They became more engaged in the classes, more willing to practice the techniques I taught, and more open to feedback and coaching. They respected me not because I was impressive, but because I was interested in them. I learned this lesson even more powerfully through my relationship with my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who lived alone next door to my first apartment in New York. Most people in the building avoided her because she was known for complaining and seemed perpetually unhappy. But I decided to apply this principle of sincere interest. I began stopping by her apartment occasionally, not to ask for anything, but simply to ask how she was doing and to listen to her stories. I discovered that she had been a nurse during World War I, had traveled extensively in her youth, and had fascinating insights about the changes she had witnessed in New York City over the decades. As I continued to show genuine interest in her experiences and opinions, Mrs. Patterson began to transform before my eyes. The complaining stopped, and she became one of the most delightful people I knew. More importantly, she became my greatest advocate in the building, recommending my teaching services to her friends and defending me when others criticized my unconventional methods. The key to making this work is that your interest must be absolutely sincere, people have an uncanny ability to detect fake interest, and nothing destroys respect faster than being caught pretending to care about something you actually find boring. True interest comes from understanding that every person has a unique story, unique challenges, and unique insights that can enrich your own understanding of life. When you approach others with genuine curiosity about their experiences, you discover fascinating aspects of human nature that you would never learn any other way. I developed a simple technique that anyone can use. Before every conversation, I remind myself that the person I'm about to meet knows something I don't know, has experienced something I haven't experienced, and has a perspective that could teach me something valuable. This mindset automatically generates genuine curiosity and interest. The practical application is straightforward. Ask questions that show you care about the other person's experiences, opinions, and feelings. How did you get started in that field? What's the most challenging part of your job? What advice would you give someone just starting out? How did that experience change your perspective? Then, and this is crucial, listen to their answers with complete attention. Don't use their response as a launching pad for your own story. Don't spend their talking time planning what you're going to say next. Give them the rare gift of your undivided attention. When you master this principle, you'll discover that people will go out of their way to help you, support you, and speak well of you to others. They'll respect you because you've given them something precious and rare. The feeling that someone genuinely cares about who they are and what they think. Let me tell you about the most underestimated tool for earning respect that exists. You smile. Not the fake, plastered-on smile that salespeople use to manipulate customers, but the genuine, warm smile that comes from finding something to genuinely appreciate about the person in front of you. I discovered the transformative power of a sincere smile through one of my students, a man named William. William came to my classes because he was failing miserably in his sales career. He was intelligent, knowledgeable about his products, and worked harder than most of his colleagues. Yet he consistently ranked at the bottom of his sales team. When I first met William, I immediately understood his problem. His face carried a perpetual expression of worry and seriousness. He approached every interaction as if it were a burden, and his facial expression communicated that to everyone he met. People instinctively avoided him because his demeanor suggested that talking to him would be unpleasant. I gave William a simple assignment. For 1 week, he was to smile genuinely at every person he encountered, whether they were potential customers, colleagues, or strangers on the street. But I emphasized that this had to be a real smile, generated by finding something positive about each person he met. The transformation was remarkable. Within a week, William's sales numbers began to improve. Within a month, he had moved from the bottom of his sales team to the top third. But more importantly, his relationships with colleagues improved dramatically. People began seeking him out for advice, inviting him to lunch, and including him in conversations he had never been part of before. The reason this worked so powerfully is rooted in basic human psychology. When you smile sincerely at someone, you're sending several important messages simultaneously. First, you're communicating that you're happy to see them, which makes them feel valued and important. Second, you're showing that you're a positive person who brings good energy to interactions, which makes people want to be around you. But perhaps most importantly, a genuine smile is contagious. When you smile at someone, they almost invariably smile back, and that physical act of smiling actually changes their emotional state. Scientists have proven that the simple act of smiling releases endorphins and creates positive feelings, even when the smile is initially forced. I learned this lesson personally during my early days of teaching. I was naturally serious and intense, focusing so intently on delivering valuable content that I forgot about the human connection. My classes were informative but lacked warmth, and I noticed that students seemed tense and defensive during sessions. One evening, I made a conscious decision to smile warmly at each student as they entered the classroom. I looked for something to genuinely appreciate about each person, perhaps their punctuality, their dedication to self-improvement, or simply their courage in taking a public speaking class. The change in the classroom atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Students began arriving early and staying late to chat. They participated more actively in exercises, took more risks in their practice sessions, and supported each other more generously. The same content delivered with a warm, appreciative smile created an entirely different learning environment. The key distinction is between a genuine smile and a fake one. A genuine smile involves your entire face, especially your eyes. It comes from finding something real to appreciate about the person you're with. A fake smile only involves your mouth and feels manipulative to both you and the other person. I developed a technique that anyone can use to generate genuine smiles. Before every interaction, I take a moment to think of something I can honestly appreciate about the person I'm about to meet. It might be their punctuality, their politeness, their dedication to their family, or simply their willingness to engage in conversation with me. This mental preparation creates a foundation of positive feeling that naturally expresses itself through a warm smile. The smile becomes a natural reflection of your internal appreciation rather than a calculated technique you're trying to employ. The respect-building power of a genuine smile is extraordinary. When you consistently greet others with warmth and appreciation, you become known as someone who brightens people's day. They associate you with positive feelings and experiences, which makes them want to spend time with you and support your goals. I've seen this principle transform marriages, business, relationships, and even difficult family dynamics. One of my students applied this technique with her teenage daughter, who had become increasingly hostile and withdrawn. By greeting her daughter with a genuine smile and finding something to appreciate about her each day, their relationship began to heal within weeks. The smile must be authentic. But the wonderful thing about this principle is that the more you practice finding things to appreciate about others, the more natural and genuine your smiles become. You begin to see the good in people more easily, which creates a positive cycle that transforms both your relationships and your own emotional well-being. Remember, a smile costs nothing but creates wealth in terms of the relationships it builds and the respect it generates. It's a gift you can give to every person you meet, and it's one of the most powerful tools you have for creating the kind of positive, respectful relationships that make life both successful and meaningful. I want to share with you one of the most powerful secrets I've learned about earning respect. A person's name is to that individual the sweetest and most important sound in any language. When you remember and use someone's name correctly, you're giving them a gift more valuable than gold. You're telling them they matter enough for you to remember who they are. This principle was driven home to me through my friendship with Jim Farley, one of the most politically successful men of his generation. Jim had an extraordinary ability to remember names, and it was largely responsible for his rise to become Postmaster General under Franklin Roosevelt. He once told me his secret. He made it a point to learn the first name of every person he met, no matter how briefly their paths crossed. Jim kept a small card file system where he recorded not just names, but personal details about each person there: family members, their interests, their birthdays, their concerns. When he encountered someone again, even months later, he could greet them by name and ask about specific things that mattered to them. "How's your son doing at college, Mary?" Or, "Did that back trouble clear up, Frank?" The effect was electric. People felt genuinely important when Jim remembered them so personally. They became devoted supporters, willing to go to extraordinary lengths to help him succeed. His ability to remember names and personal details created a network of loyal, relationships that propelled him to the highest levels of government. I witnessed this power personally when I started applying the same principle in my teaching. In my early classes, I made the mistake that most instructors make, focused on delivering content without bothering to learn my students' names. I referred to them as you in the blue shirt or the gentleman in the third row. The atmosphere was formal and distant. Everything changed when I decided to learn every student's name by the second class session. I developed a simple system. I would arrive early and greet each person individually, repeating their names several times in conversation. Good evening, Robert. How was your week, Robert? I'm looking forward to hearing your speech tonight, Robert. During the class, I made sure to use each person's name multiple times. Instead of saying that's a good point, I would say that's an excellent observation, Margaret. Instead of who has a question, I would ask Charles, what's your experience with this technique? The transformation was remarkable. Students became more engaged, more willing to participate, and more supportive of each other. They started arriving early to chat and staying late to continue discussions. The simple act of using their names had created a sense of community and belonging that transformed the entire learning experience. But the most profound example of this principle came through my relationship with a janitor at one of the buildings where I taught evening classes. Most people completely ignored him, treating him as if he were invisible. I made it a point to learn his name, Thomas, and to greet him warmly each evening. Good evening, Thomas. How are you tonight? I would ask, and then actually listen to his response. I learned that he had been working 2 jobs to support his family, that he was taking correspondence courses to improve his education, and that he had dreams of starting his own small business someday. Over time, Thomas became one of my greatest allies. He would make sure my classroom was perfectly prepared, often staying late to help me set up special equipment. He would save me the best parking spaces and even recommend my courses to other people in the building. More importantly, he became a friend whose respect and support meant a great deal to me. The technique for remembering names is simpler than most people think. First, when someone tells you their name, repeat it immediately. Nice to meet you, Sarah. Then use it several times during your conversation. Sarah, what line of work are you in? And that's fascinating, Sarah. If the name is unusual or difficult, ask them to spell it or ask about its origin. People are usually delighted to share the story behind their name, and the conversation helps cement it in your memory. Anastasia, wait. A beautiful name. Is that Greek? This shows you care enough to get it right and gives you multiple memory anchors. After the conversation, write the name down along with any personal details you learned. Review these notes before your next meeting. This small investment of time pays enormous dividends in the strength of your relationships. Remember, when you use someone's name, you're acknowledging their individual identity and importance. In a world where most people feel anonymous and overlooked, this simple courtesy makes you stand out as someone who truly sees and values others. The respect and loyalty this generates will serve you throughout your life. If I could teach you only one skill for earning respect and building relationships, it would be the art of listening. Not just hearing words, but truly listening with your whole attention, your heart, and your mind. In my years of studying human nature, I've discovered that listening is the ultimate form of respect you can show another person. Most people are terrible listeners. They're so busy planning what they're going to say next, or thinking about their own problems, or judging what the other person is telling them, that they miss the incredible gift being offered the chance to understand another human being's thoughts, feelings, and experiences. I learned this lesson through one of the most humbling experiences of my teaching career. I had a student named Mrs. Douglas, a widow in her 60s who rarely spoke during class discussions. When she did participate, I found myself impatiently waiting for her to finish so we could move on to what I considered more important matters. One evening, Mrs. Douglas stayed after class and asked if she could speak with me privately. What followed was a 2-hour conversation that changed my understanding of listening forever. She told me about losing her husband after 40 years of marriage, about the loneliness that consumed her daily life, and about how taking my public speaking class was her desperate attempt to connect with other people again. As she spoke, I realized that for months I had been dismissing her contributions as irrelevant, when in reality she had been offering profound insights about courage, resilience, and human connection. I had been so focused on my curriculum that I had completely missed the wisdom sitting right in front of me. From that night forward, I made listening my priority. I discovered that when you give someone your complete attention, you're giving them something precious and rare. You're telling them that what they think and feel matters to you. You're showing them a level of respect that most people never experience. The transformation in my classes was immediate. When I started truly listening to my students, not just waiting for my turn to talk, but genuinely absorbing what they were sharing, they began to open up in ways I had never experienced. They shared personal stories, asked deeper questions, and supported each other with remarkable generosity. But the real revelation came when I applied this principle to my personal relationships. I had a neighbor, Mr. Peterson, who was known throughout our building as a difficult, cantankerous old man. Most residents avoided him because he seemed to complain about everything and everyone. Instead of avoiding him, I decided to listen, really listen. The next time I encountered him in the lobby, instead of rushing past with a quick greeting, I stopped and asked how he was doing. Then I did something revolutionary. I waited for his answer and listened to it completely. What I discovered amazed me. Mr. Peterson wasn't a difficult person. He was a lonely person who had fascinating stories about his experiences as a young engineer, building bridges across the American West. He had wisdom about construction, about perseverance, and about adapting to change that was remarkable, but no one had ever taken the time to listen to him. Over the following months, Mr. Peterson became one of my closest friends. He stopped complaining and started sharing. He began greeting other residents warmly and even organized a building social event. The difficult man had simply been a man who needed someone to listen to him. True listening requires several key elements. First, you must give the speaker your complete attention. This means putting down your phone, turning away from your computer, and facing the person who is speaking. Your body language should communicate that nothing else matters to you in that moment except what they're saying. Second, you must listen without judgment. Don't spend their talking time deciding whether you agree or disagree with what they're saying. Don't formulate arguments or prepare rebuttals. Simply absorb their perspective and try to understand their point of view. Third, listen for feelings as well as facts. Often the emotions behind someone's words are more important than the specific details they're sharing. When a colleague complains about their workload, they may not be asking for solutions. They may simply need someone to understand that they're feeling overwhelmed. Fourth, ask questions that show you're engaged and want to understand more deeply. How did that make you feel? What was the most challenging part of that experience? What would you do differently if you faced that situation again? These questions demonstrate that you value their insights and want to learn from their experiences. Finally, resist the urge to immediately share your own similar experience. When someone tells you about a problem they're facing, don't respond with the same thing happened to me. Instead, stay focused on their experience and help them explore their own thoughts and feelings about it. I developed a simple technique that transformed my listening ability. Before every conversation, I remind myself that this person knows something I don't know, and my job is to discover what that is. This mindset automatically makes me curious and attentive rather than judgmental or impatient. The respect that comes from being a great listener is profound and lasting. When you consistently give others the gift of your complete attention, you become known as someone who truly cares about people. They will seek you out when they need advice, support you when you face challenges, and speak highly of you to others. More importantly, by becoming a great listener, you'll learn more about human nature, gain insights that will help you in every area of your life, and build relationships that are both meaningful and enduring. In a world full of people desperate to be heard, the person who truly listens has an extraordinary advantage. One of the most powerful ways to earn someone's respect and affection is to discover what truly excites them and then engage with genuine enthusiasm about their passions. When you learn to talk about what interests others, you tap into an inexhaustible source of positive energy and connection. I learned this principle through Benjamin Franklin, whose wisdom I studied extensively. Franklin had a remarkable ability to connect with people from all walks of life, from farmers to philosophers, from merchants to statesmen. His secret wasn't his intelligence, though he was brilliant. It was his genuine curiosity about what mattered to each person he met. Franklin once told a story about meeting a man who seemed hostile and dismissive toward him. Instead of arguing or trying to impress the man with his own accomplishments, Franklin asked about the man's obvious expertise in bookbinding. For the next hour, he listened with fascination as the man explained the intricacies of his crafts, the selection of materials, the techniques for creating durable bindings, the artistry involved in the process. By the end of their conversation, the hostile stranger had become a friend and supporter. Franklin's sincere interest in the man's professional passion had transformed their relationship completely. The man felt valued and respected for his expertise, and Franklin had gained both a friend and valuable knowledge about an craft he had never understood before. I applied this principle with remarkable success in my own teaching and personal relationships. One of my most challenging students was a man named George, a factory supervisor who seemed angry and resistant to everything I taught. He sat in the back of the classroom with his arms crossed, rarely participated, and often made sarcastic comments that disrupted the class. Instead of confronting George directly, I decided to discover what interested him. During a break, I noticed him reading a magazine about fishing. I approached him and asked about his fishing experiences. His entire demeanor changed instantly. For the next 20 minutes, he enthusiastically described his favorite fishing spots, the techniques he used for different types of fish, and the equipment he had collected over the years. From that evening forward, George became one of my most engaged students. I would often start our conversations by asking about his latest fishing adventures, and he would share his experiences with obvious pleasure. More importantly, he began to see me as someone who respected his interests and expertise, which made him much more receptive to learning the communication skills I was teaching. The key to making this work is that your interest must be absolutely genuine. People can instantly detect fake enthusiasm, and nothing destroys trust faster than being caught pretending to care about something you actually find boring. The solution is to develop genuine curiosity about the endless variety of human interests and expertise. I discovered that every person, no matter how ordinary they might seem, has developed expertise or passion in some area of life. The accountant might be an expert on jazz music. The secretary might have extraordinary knowledge about gardening. The truck driver might be passionate about astronomy. When you learn to uncover these hidden interests, you gain access to fascinating aspects of human experience. My most memorable example of this principle involved my landlord, Mr. Kowalski, a gruff Polish immigrant who seemed to dislike everyone in our building. He was always complaining about noise, demanding immediate payment of rent, and generally making life unpleasant for all the tenants. One day, I noticed him carefully tending to a small garden behind the building. Instead of hurrying past, as I usually did, I stopped and asked about his plants. His transformation was remarkable. For the next hour, He shared his extensive knowledge about soil preparation, plant selection, and growing techniques he had learned from his father in Poland. I learned that gardening was his passion and his connection to his homeland. He had been feeling isolated and unappreciated in America, but when I showed genuine interest in his gardening expertise, he felt valued and respected. From that day forward, Mr. Kowalski became not just tolerable, but actually helpful and friendly. He would save choice vegetables from his garden for me and even helped me when I needed to make apartment repairs. The technique for discovering others' interests is straightforward, but requires genuine curiosity. Pay attention to what people mention casually in conversation, what they read, what they do in their spare time, or what makes their faces light up when they talk about it. Then ask open-ended questions that invite them to share their knowledge and enthusiasm. How did you get interested in that? What's the most rewarding part of doing that? What would you recommend for someone just starting out? What's the biggest misconception people have about that hobby? When they respond, listen with genuine interest and ask follow-up questions that show you want to understand more. Don't use their answers as springboards for your own stories. Stay focused on their expertise and passion. This principle works because it satisfies two fundamental human needs simultaneously: the need to feel important and the need to share what we love with others. When you give someone the opportunity to talk about their passion with an appreciative audience, you're providing them with one of life's greatest pleasures. The respect and affection you earn through this approach is both immediate and lasting. People will remember you as someone who truly cared about what mattered to them, and they'll associate you with the positive feelings they experienced while sharing their enthusiasm. Remember, everyone is an expert at something, and everyone has interests that bring them joy. When you learn to discover and appreciate these interests, you transform ordinary acquaintanceships into meaningful relationships built on mutual respect and genuine connection. The deepest principle in human nature is the craving to be appreciated and to feel important. This isn't vanity or ego, it's a fundamental psychological need that drives virtually all human behavior. When you learn to make others feel genuinely important, you unlock one of the most powerful tools for earning respect and building lasting relationships. I discovered this principle through my work with thousands of business leaders, and I saw how the most successful among them had mastered the art of making their employees, colleagues, and customers feel valued and significant. They understood that people will go to extraordinary lengths for those who make them feel important. Let me share the story of Charles Schwab, who was earning a salary of over $1 million a year when most executives earned a fraction of that amount. When I asked him about his secret, he told me it wasn't his technical knowledge of steel production. Many men knew more about that than he did. His success came from his ability to make his workers feel important and appreciated. Schwab would walk through his steel mills and find opportunities to recognize good work. When he saw a worker doing something well, he wouldn't just notice it silently. He would stop and acknowledge it publicly. "That's excellent work, Peterson. I can see you take real pride in getting those measurements exactly right." He would then make sure other workers heard his praise, amplifying the recognition. But Schwab went beyond simple praise. He made his workers feel important by asking for their opinions and advice. He would say things like, "You've been working with this equipment longer than anyone else, Martinez. What do you think we could do to improve efficiency here?" He treated his workers as experts whose insights were valuable, not just as hands to follow orders. The result was extraordinary: loyalty and productivity. Schwab's workers didn't just do their jobs, they went above and beyond because they felt genuinely valued and important. They knew their contributions mattered to someone who mattered, and that made all the difference. I applied this principle in my own teaching with remarkable results. Instead of treating my students as empty vessels to be filled with my knowledge, I began to recognize and celebrate their unique contributions to our discussions. When a student shared an insight, I would acknowledge its value. "That's a brilliant observation, Robert. You've identified something that most people miss completely." I started asking my students for their advice and opinions. "Margaret, you have extensive experience in customer service. How would you handle a situation like this?" This approach made them feel like experts and partners in the learning process, rather than passive recipients of instruction. The transformation was remarkable. Students became more engaged, more willing to participate, and more supportive of each other. They took ownership of their learning because they felt important and valued in the classroom environment. But my most powerful lesson in making others feel important came through my relationship with my secretary, Miss Johnson. When she first started working for me, I treated her like most executives treat their support staff, someone whose job was to handle routine tasks so I could focus on important work. Everything changed when I realized that Miss Johnson's work was crucial to my success and began treating her accordingly. Instead of simply giving her tasks, I started explaining why each task was important and how it contributed to our overall goals. "Miss Johnson, these follow-up letters are crucial because they help our students continue applying what they've learned. Your attention to detail in personalizing each one makes a real difference in their success." I began asking for her input. "On business decisions, you interact with our students more than anyone else. What concerns or questions do you hear most often?" I implemented many of her suggestions and always gave her credit when they proved successful. I also made sure to acknowledge her contributions publicly. When colleagues visited my office, I would introduce her as Miss Johnson, who really runs this operation and makes everything possible. When students complimented our service, I would make sure she heard their praise and knew that her work had made the difference. The results exceeded my expectations. Miss Johnson transformed from someone who simply did her assigned tasks to someone who took ownership of our entire operation's success. She anticipated problems before they occurred, suggested improvements I never would have thought of, and went far beyond her job description to ensure everything ran smoothly. More importantly, she became one of my most loyal advocates. She spoke highly of our organization to everyone she met, recommended our services to her friends and family, and defended our reputation when others criticized us. The key to making others feel important is to recognize that everyone contributes something valuable, regardless of their position or role. The janitor who keeps your building clean, the receptionist who greets your customers, the clerk who processes your orders. Each person plays a crucial part in the overall success of any organization or relationship. Practical ways to make others feel important include using phrases like, "What do you think about ... Your experience with this is valuable. I respect your opinion on ... You're the expert when it comes to ... These phrases signal that you value their thoughts and expertise. Always give credit where credit is due, and give it publicly when possible. When someone's idea proves successful, make sure others know who contributed it. When someone does good work, acknowledge it in front of their peers, supervisors, or family members. Ask for advice and opinions, even on matters where you might have more technical expertise. Often, people who work closely with systems or customers have insights that experts miss. Their perspective is valuable precisely because it's different from yours. Remember birthdays, work anniversaries, and personal milestones. Take time to acknowledge these occasions, even briefly. This shows that you see them as a whole person, not just a function or role. The magic of making others feel important is that it creates a positive cycle. When people feel valued and significant, they naturally want to live up to that positive image. They become more productive, more loyal, and more willing to go the extra mile because they know their efforts are appreciated and recognized. Most importantly, when you consistently make others feel important, you earn their deep respect and lasting loyalty. They know that you see their value as human beings, and they will remember and reciprocate that recognition throughout your relationship. Nothing destroys respect faster than telling someone they're wrong, even when they clearly are. The moment you say you're wrong, or that's not right, or you don't understand, you've attacked their intelligence, their judgment, and their self-esteem. You may win the argument, but you'll lose their respect and cooperation. I learned this lesson the hard way during my early teaching days. I had a student named Mr. Harrison who constantly challenged my methods with ideas that I knew were ineffective. My instinct was to correct him immediately and forcefully. "No, Mr. Harrison, that approach won't work because ... I would explain why he was wrong and why my method was superior. The result was predictable. Mr. Harrison became increasingly defensive and hostile. He started challenging everything I said, not because he was genuinely confused, but because I had made him feel foolish and attacked. Our classroom discussions became tense battles rather than collaborative learning experiences. Everything changed when I discovered Abraham Lincoln's approach to disagreement. Lincoln, one of the most respected leaders in American history, had mastered the art of disagreeing without disrespecting. Even when he fundamentally disagreed with someone, he would begin by finding common ground and acknowledging what was valid in their position. Lincoln would say things like, "I appreciate your concern about this issue, and you raise an important point that deserves consideration. My experience has led me to a slightly different conclusion, and I'd like to share my perspective with you." He never made people feel wrong or stupid, even when their ideas were completely misguided. I decided to apply Lincoln's approach with Mr. Harrison the next time he proposed an ineffective technique. Instead of contradicting him directly, I said, "That's an interesting approach, Mr. Harrison, and I can see why you'd think that might work. I've tried something similar in the past, and I discovered that a slight modification made it even more effective. Let me share what I learned." The transformation was immediate. Mr. Harrison stopped being defensive and started being curious. He began asking genuine questions about my suggestions and even started implementing them enthusiastically. By preserving his dignity while sharing my knowledge, I had transformed an adversary into an ally. The key principle is to disagree with ideas, not with people. Instead of saying "you're wrong about that," say "I see that differently," or "my experience has been different," or "I've found another approach that works well." This allows you to present your viewpoint without attacking their intelligence or judgment. I learned another powerful technique from watching diplomatic negotiations. Skilled diplomats never begin by highlighting disagreements. They start by identifying areas of agreement. We both want to find a solution that works for everyone. We both care about the long-term success of this project. We both want to make sure we're being fair to all parties involved. This approach establishes a foundation of shared values and common goals before addressing areas of disagreement. It reminds everyone involved that you're working toward the same ultimate objectives, even if you disagree about methods or details. One of my most successful applications of this principle occurred during a business meeting where I fundamentally disagreed with a proposed marketing strategy. The conventional approach would have been to point out the flaws in their plan and explain why it wouldn't work. Instead, I said, "I really appreciate the creativity and effort that went into this proposal. You've identified some important market opportunities that we definitely need to address. I've been thinking about how we might approach this challenge, and I'd like to share some additional ideas that might complement what you've developed." This approach allowed me to present an entirely different strategy without making anyone feel that their work was unvalued or their ideas were foolish. The team embraced my suggestions enthusiastically because I had preserved their dignity while offering better alternatives. Another crucial element is to avoid absolute statements. Instead of saying that will never work or that's completely wrong, use softer language. I wonder if there might be some challenges with that approach, or what do you think about trying this variation? These phrases invite discussion rather than triggering defensiveness. When you must point out errors or problems, focus on the situation rather than the person. Say there seems to be an issue with these numbers rather than you made an error in your calculations. This allows the person to correct the problem without feeling personally attacked. I also learned to ask questions rather than make statements when I disagreed with someone. Instead of saying that won't work because customers won't accept it, I would ask, how do you think customers will respond to that change? This approach lets them discover potential problems themselves, which is far more effective than having problems pointed out to them. The most important aspect of respectful disagreement is to remain genuinely open to the possibility that the other person might be right. Sometimes people have information you don't have, perspectives you haven't considered, or insights that could improve your own thinking. When you approach disagreements with genuine curiosity rather than a determination to prove your point, you often discover valuable ideas you would have missed otherwise. I've seen this principle transform workplace relationships, family dynamics, and community discussions. When people feel that their ideas are respected, even when they're not accepted, they remain open to dialogue and collaboration. They're willing to consider your perspective because you've demonstrated respect for theirs. Remember, the goal isn't to avoid all disagreement, to disagree in a way that preserves relationships and maintains mutual respect. When you master this skill, people will seek out your opinions because they know you'll treat their ideas with dignity, even when you don't agree with them. This approach builds the kind of trust and respect that makes all your other relationships more effective and more satisfying. One of the most counterintuitive principles I've discovered is that admitting your mistakes quickly and emphatically can actually increase rather than decrease the respect others have for you. Most people believe that acknowledging errors makes them appear weak or incompetent, but the opposite is true. It demonstrates strength, integrity, and confidence. I learned this lesson through a painful personal experience early in my teaching career. I had given incorrect advice to one of my students, a salesman named Robert, about how to handle a difficult customer situation. Following my guidance, Robert approached his biggest client with a strategy that backfired spectacularly, nearly costing him the account. When Robert told me what had happened, my first instinct was to defend my advice and find reasons why the strategy should have worked. I started explaining how the customer's reaction was unusual and unpredictable, how Robert might have misapplied the technique, and how external factors had interfered with the process. But as I watched Robert's face during my explanation, I realized I was making the situation worse. He wasn't looking for excuses or rationalizations. He was looking for accountability and better guidance. My defensiveness was destroying his confidence in me as a teacher and mentor. I stopped mid-sentence and said, "Robert, I need to be completely honest with you. I gave you bad advice. I misread the situation and recommended an approach that was wrong for your particular customer. This failure is entirely my responsibility, and I'm sorry my guidance put your important relationship at risk." The change in Robert's demeanor was immediate and remarkable. Instead of anger or disappointment, he showed relief and renewed respect. He said, "Mr. Carnegie, the fact that you can admit that mistake makes me trust your judgment even more. Now I know you'll always give me your honest assessment rather than trying to protect your reputation." From that moment forward, Robert became one of my most dedicated students and eventually one of my most successful graduates. My willingness to admit my error had actually strengthened our relationship and increased his confidence in my teaching. This principle works because admitting mistakes demonstrates several admirable qualities simultaneously. First, it shows intellectual honesty. You care more about truth than about being right. Second, it demonstrates humility. You're secure enough in yourself to acknowledge imperfection. Third, it shows respect for the other person. You'll trust them enough to be vulnerable and honest. I feel this principle worked powerfully in the business world through a client named Mr. Thompson, who managed a large retail store. He had implemented a new inventory system that created significant problems for his staff. Instead of blaming the software company or making excuses about unexpected complications, he called a staff meeting and said, "I made a serious error in judgment when I chose this new system. I didn't adequately research how it would affect your daily work, and I didn't get enough input from you before making the decision. The problems you're experiencing are the result of my poor planning, and I take full responsibility for the disruption this has caused." He then outlined his plan for fixing the problems and asked for the staff's help in making the transition smoother. The response from his employees was extraordinary. Instead of resentment and resistance, they showed appreciation for his honesty and enthusiastic support for solving the problems together. One employee told me later, "We've had managers before who would never admit when they were wrong. They'd blame everyone else and make us feel like failures when their decisions didn't work out. Mr. Thompson's honesty made us want to work harder to help him succeed." The key to making this principle work effectively is speed and completeness. When you realize you've made a mistake, admit it immediately and take full responsibility. Don't wait for someone else to discover the error. And don't try to minimize your role in what went wrong. Use clear, direct language. "I was wrong," or "I made a mistake," or "this was my error." Avoid phrases like "mistakes were made," or perhaps "I could have done better." These sound like you're still trying to avoid responsibility. After acknowledging the mistake, focus on solutions rather than excuses. Explain what you're going to do to fix the problem and prevent similar errors in the future. This shows that you're taking constructive action rather than just offering empty apologies. I learned to apply this principle in my personal relationships as well. When I said something hurtful to my wife during an argument, instead of defending my words or waiting for her to bring up the issue, I would go to her immediately and say, "I was completely wrong to speak to you that way. What I said was unfair and unkind, and I'm genuinely sorry for hurting you." This approach consistently transformed potential ongoing conflicts into opportunities for deeper understanding and connection. My willingness to admit fault quickly prevented resentment from building and demonstrated my commitment to treating her with respect. The psychological reason this works so well is that most people expect others to be defensive about their mistakes. When you instead take immediate responsibility, you disarm their anger and frustration. They can't argue with someone who's already acknowledging what went wrong. Moreover, your honesty about your own imperfections makes you more relatable and trustworthy. People respect leaders and colleagues who are secure enough to admit when they're wrong, because it suggests they can be trusted to be honest about other important matters as well. Remember, everyone makes mistakes. It's an inevitable part of being human. The difference between people who earn respect and those who lose it isn't whether they make errors, but how they handle those errors when they occur. When you learn to admit your mistakes quickly and completely, you transform potential relationship damaging situations into opportunities to demonstrate your character and strengthen your connections with others. No one likes to receive orders. Even when people comply with direct commands, they often do so resentfully and with minimal effort. But when you learn to ask questions instead of giving orders, you tap into something powerful: people's natural desire to think for themselves and take ownership of their decisions. I discovered this principle through observing one of the most effective managers I ever knew, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who ran a large department store. Instead of telling her employees what to do, she had a remarkable ability to guide them toward the right decisions through skillful questioning. When she noticed that the clothing displays needed reorganization, Instead of saying rearrange these displays to show the new merchandise more prominently, she would ask, what do you think would help customers notice our new arrivals more easily? The employees would then suggest the exact changes she had in mind, but because the ideas came from them, they implemented them with enthusiasm and creativity. When sales were declining in a particular department, instead of demanding you need to be more aggressive in approaching customers, she would ask, what do you think might help customers feel more comfortable making purchases in this section? Again, her team would identify the solutions themselves and take ownership of implementing them. The psychological reason this works so powerfully is that people have much more commitment to ideas they help create than to ideas imposed on them by others. When someone arrives at a conclusion through their own thinking process, they feel intelligent and capable. When someone simply follows orders, they feel like subordinates carrying out someone else's will. I applied this principle in my teaching with remarkable results. Instead of telling students you need to practice your speeches more, I would ask, what do you think would help you feel more confident and polished in your delivery? They would invariably identify practice as the solution, but because they had reached that conclusion themselves, they were much more likely to actually do the work. When a student was struggling with organizing their material, instead of saying, you should outline your speech before writing it, I would ask, what approaches have you found helpful for organizing complex information in other areas of your life? Often, they would describe methods they used at work or in their studies, and then realize they could apply the same organizational principles to their speeches. Asterisk. The most dramatic example of this principle occurred with my relationship with my teenage nephew who was living with us temporarily. David was rebellious and resistant to any suggestions about his behavior, schoolwork, or future plans. Traditional approaches, telling him what he should do, explaining why his current choices were problematic, or setting rules and consequences, only made him more defiant. I decided to try the questioning approach. Instead of lecturing him about the importance of education, I asked, what kind of life do you want to have when you're 30? What would make you feel successful and satisfied? As he described his dreams and ambitions, I continued with questions. What do you think would help you develop the skills and opportunities to achieve those goals? Through this process, David began to see connections between his current choices and his future aspirations that he had never considered before. More importantly, because these insights came from his own thinking rather than from my lectures, he took ownership of making changes. He started studying more diligently, treating people more respectfully, and planning more thoughtfully for his future. The key to asking effective questions is to make them genuinely open-ended and to be prepared to accept answers that might differ from what you expected. If you ask a question but then argue with or dismiss the response, people will quickly realize that you're trying to manipulate them rather than genuinely seeking their input. Start with questions that establish the desired outcome. What would success look like in this situation? Or what result are we hoping to achieve? This helps ensure that everyone is working toward the same goal, even if they choose different methods for reaching it. Then ask questions that help people analyze the current situation. What factors do you think are contributing to this problem? Or what obstacles might we need to overcome? This encourages them to think critically about the challenges involved. Follow with questions that generate solutions. What approaches do you think might work? Or what has been effective in similar situations you've encountered? This allows people to draw on their own experience and creativity rather than simply following your prescribed solution. Finally, ask questions about implementation. How would you want to move forward with this? Or what would be the best first step? This ensures that people have thought through the practical aspects of their chosen approach and have committed to specific actions. I learned to apply this principle even in simple daily interactions. Instead, of telling my secretary file these reports alphabetically. I would ask, what filing system do you think would make these reports easiest to find when we need them? Instead of instructing my students arrive 10 minutes early for class, I would ask, what arrival time would give you the best opportunity to prepare mentally for the session? These small changes in approach had significant effects on people's attitudes and performance. When people feel that their intelligence and judgment are respected, they respond with greater effort and creativity than when they feel like they're simply following orders. The respect you earn through this approach is profound because you're demonstrating trust in others' ability to think and make good decisions. You're treating them as partners and collaborators, rather than as subordinates who need to be told what to do. Remember, the goal isn't to manipulate people into reaching predetermined conclusions, to engage their minds and help them think through situations more thoroughly than they might on their own. When you master the art of guiding through questions rather than directing through orders, you'll find that people not only respect your leadership, but actively seek out your guidance because they know you'll help them think more clearly rather than simply telling them what to think. Even when someone is clearly wrong, making them feel foolish or embarrassed will destroy any chance of earning their respect or cooperation. The art of letting others save face preserving their dignity, even when correcting their errors, is one of the most sophisticated and powerful principles of human relations I've ever discovered. I learned this lesson through a situation that could have ended my teaching career before it truly began. During one of my early public speaking classes, I had a student named Mr. Crawford, a successful businessman who was accustomed to being the authority in most situations. During a practice session, he completely misapplied a technique I had taught, creating an awkward and ineffective presentation. My instinct was to correct him immediately and thoroughly in front of the entire class. After all, the other students needed to understand the proper approach, and Mr. Crawford's mistake was so obvious that everyone could see what had gone wrong. I started to say, "No, Mr. Crawford, you've completely misunderstood the technique. Let me show you the correct way too." But something in his expression stopped me. I could see that he was already embarrassed and defensive. Public correction would have humiliated him and likely driven him from the class entirely. Instead, I said, "Mr. Crawford, you're clearly working hard to master this technique. Let me share a small refinement that might make it even more effective for you." I then demonstrated the correct approach without emphasizing how his attempt had been wrong, focusing instead on the improved version as an enhancement rather than a correction. After class, I spoke with him privately to provide more detailed guidance, but always in the context of helping him build on what he was already doing well. Mr. Crawford not only remained in the class, but became one of my most successful students, and eventually one of my strongest advocates. Years later, he told me that my respectful handling of that early mistake had convinced him that I was a teacher worth learning from, rather than someone who would embarrass students for his own ego. The principle of saving face is particularly important when dealing with people in positions of authority or expertise. When you make such people look foolish, even when they genuinely are wrong, you create an enemy who will resist everything you try to accomplish going forward. I saw this principle work beautifully in a business situation involving a company president who had made a strategic decision that was clearly failing. The board of directors needed to change course, but they couldn't simply announce that the president had been wrong without undermining his authority and damaging company morale. Instead, the board chairman approached the situation by saying, "The market conditions have evolved since we made our original decision, and new information suggests we should adapt our strategy. Your leadership in recognizing when circumstances change and adjusting accordingly is exactly what this company needs." This approach allowed the president to change direction while maintaining his dignity and authority. He could present the new strategy as a thoughtful adaptation to changing conditions rather than an admission of error. And his team continued to respect his leadership throughout the transition. The key to letting others save face is to provide them with a dignified explanation for why change is necessary or appropriate. Instead of focusing on what they did wrong, focus on new information, changed circumstances, or enhanced understanding that makes a different approach advisable. Use phrases like "given what we've learned since then, or now that we have additional information, double quotes, or as circumstances have evolved." These phrases suggest that the original decision was reasonable based on what was known at the time, but that new factors make adjustments sensible. I applied this principle with my own family. When my wife made a decorating choice that didn't work well in our living room, instead of saying "that lamp doesn't look good there," or "you picked the wrong spot for that," I said, "Now that we've lived with this arrangement for a while, I'm wondering if we might try the lamp in a different location to get better lighting." For reading, this approach allowed her to move the lamp without feeling criticized for her original choice. She could present the change as an improvement based on our actual usage patterns, rather than an admission that her initial placement had been wrong. When correcting employees or colleagues, frame the correction as additional training or clarification rather than as fixing a mistake. Say, "Let me show you another technique that might work even better," instead of "you're doing that wrong." This preserves their confidence while ensuring they learn the correct approach in written communication. This principle is especially important. Email and memos that make people look foolish can be forwarded to others, amplifying the embarrassment. Always write corrections and suggestions in ways that preserve the recipient's dignity, even when you're certain they won't share the communication with others. When someone has made a mistake in a public setting, address it privately whenever possible. If public correction is necessary, focus on the issue rather than the person. Say, "Let's look at this data again," rather than "you misread this information." This allows the group to correct course without anyone feeling personally attacked. I learned to apply this principle even in casual social situations. When someone tells a story that contains obvious factual errors, instead of correcting them directly, I might say something like, "That reminds me of something similar I heard," though the details were a bit different. This allows them to save face while ensuring that accurate information is available to everyone present. The respect you earn through this approach is immense because people recognize that you care about their dignity and reputation. They trust that you'll handle their mistakes and shortcomings with discretion and kindness, which makes them much more willing to admit errors, ask for help, and accept guidance from you. Moreover, when you consistently help others save face, you create an environment where people feel safe to take risks, try new approaches, and acknowledge when something isn't working. This leads to better communication, more innovation, and stronger relationships throughout your personal and professional life. Remember, everyone makes mistakes and poor decisions sometimes. The difference between leaders who earn lasting respect and those who create resentment isn't whether they address these errors, but how they do so. When you master the art of correcting problems while preserving dignity, you'll become someone people trust and want to work with, even when difficult conversations are necessary. Most people wait for perfection before offering praise, but this approach misses the most powerful opportunities for building respect and motivating positive change. The secret is to praise every improvement, no matter how small, because recognition of progress creates momentum that leads to dramatic transformation over time. I discovered this principle through working with one of my most challenging students, a man named Walter, who came to my public speaking classes with crippling anxiety about speaking in front of groups. During his first presentation, he was so nervous that he could barely speak above a whisper. His hands shook visibly, and he forgot most of what he had planned to say. Most instructors would have focused on everything that needed improvement: his volume, his posture, his organization, his eye contact. But I had learned that criticism, even constructive criticism, often paralyzes people who are already struggling with confidence. Instead, I found something genuine to praise. "Walter," I said after his presentation, "I was impressed by your courage in standing up there despite how nervous you were feeling. That takes real character, and it shows your commitment to growing as a communicator." The change in Walter's expression was immediate. He had expected criticism and disappointment, but instead received recognition for something he hadn't even realized was praiseworthy: his willingness to face his fear. This small acknowledgement gave him confidence to continue practicing. Over the following weeks, I continued to praise every improvement Walter made, no matter how minor. When his voice became slightly stronger, I acknowledged it. When he made eye contact with one person in the audience, I recognized that progress. When he remembered to include his main points without notes, I celebrated that achievement. Each piece of praise built on the previous ones, creating a foundation of confidence that enabled Walter to take bigger risks and make greater improvements. By the end of the course, he had become one of our most effective speakers and eventually built a successful career that required regular public presentations. The psychological principle behind this approach is that people tend to live up to the positive expectations and recognition they receive. When you praise someone for improvement, you're not just acknowledging what they've already done. You're encouraging them to continue developing in that direction. I saw this principle work powerfully with my secretary, Miss Rodriguez, who initially struggled with organizing complex correspondence and scheduling. Instead of focusing on her mistakes or the areas where she needed improvement, I made it a point to acknowledge every small advancement in her skills. When she handled a difficult phone call more diplomatically than usual, I mentioned it. "I heard how professionally you handled that challenging caller earlier. Your patience and courtesy really represented our organization well." When she developed a new filing system that saved time, I made sure to recognize her initiative. "This new organization system you created is going to make all of our work more efficient." That kind of thinking is exactly what makes the difference. These acknowledgments motivated Miss Rodriguez to continue developing her skills and taking initiative in areas I had never specifically asked her to improve. She began anticipating problems before they occurred, suggesting improvements to our procedures, and taking pride in delivering exceptional service to our clients. The key to effective praise is specificity and genuineness. Instead of general comments like "good job" or "nice work," identify exactly what the person did well and why it was valuable. This shows that you are paying attention and that your praise is based on genuine observation rather than empty encouragement. Say things like your attention to detail in checking those calculations prevented what could have been a costly error, or the way you explained that complex concept made it much easier for everyone to understand, or your persistence in solving that problem saved us significant time and frustration. I learned to document improvements so I could track and acknowledge progress over time. When working with someone who was developing new skills, I would make notes about their growth and periodically remind them of how far they had come. "Walter, do you remember how nervous you were during your first presentation 3 months ago? Look at how confidently you're speaking now. That transformation is the result of your consistent effort and courage." This approach works especially well with people who are struggling or who have been receiving primarily critical feedback. Often, these individuals have become so focused on their shortcomings that they can't see their own progress. Your recognition helps them notice and appreciate their improvement, which motivates them to continue growing. I applied this principle in my personal relationships as well. When my wife made efforts to try new recipes or learn new skills, I made sure to acknowledge her willingness to experiment and any positive results, even when the outcomes weren't perfect. This encouragement led to continued growth and innovation that enriched our life together. With children, this principle is especially powerful. Instead of waiting for perfect behavior or performance before offering praise, I learned to recognize any movement in the right direction. I noticed you put your toys away without being reminded today. That shows real responsibility. Or you handled that frustration much better than last week. You're learning to control your emotions. The timing of praise is crucial. Acknowledge improvements as soon as possible after you notice them, while the positive behavior is still fresh in the person's mind. This immediate reinforcement strengthens the connection between the improvement and the positive feeling of recognition. Be sure to praise both effort and results. Sometimes people work hard without achieving perfect outcomes, and acknowledging their effort encourages them to continue trying. I can see how much thought and effort you put into preparing for this presentation, and that dedication really shows in your delivery. Remember, improvement is a process, not an event. When you consistently recognize and praise progress, you create an environment where people feel safe to take risks, try new approaches, and continue developing their capabilities. They begin to associate you with positive recognition and growth, which builds deep respect and loyalty over time. The magic of praising improvement is that it costs you nothing but creates enormous value for others. In a world where most people focus on what's wrong or what needs to be fixed, becoming someone who notices and acknowledges what's getting better makes you a source of encouragement and motivation that people naturally respect and appreciate. One of the most transformative discoveries I've made about human nature is that people invariably try to live up to the reputation you give them. When you consistently treat someone as if they possess admirable qualities, even if they haven't fully demonstrated those qualities, yet they will often develop those very characteristics to match your expectations. I learned this principle through working with a young man named Eddie, who came to my attention through his employer, a friend of mine who managed a small manufacturing company. Eddie had been labeled as a troublemaker by previous supervisors, was frequently late, often argued with co-workers, and seemed to have a generally negative attitude about work. When my friend asked for advice about whether to fire Eddie, I suggested trying a different approach. Instead of focusing on Eddie's problems, I recommended that my friend start treating him as if he were a valuable employee with potential for leadership and growth. The next Monday, my friend called Eddie into his office and said, "Eddie, I've been watching your work, and I can see that you have natural leadership abilities and a good understanding of our production processes. I'm wondering if you'd be interested in taking on some additional responsibilities that would help you develop those talents." He then gave Eddie a small supervisory role over a new project, explaining that he was choosing Eddie because he believed Eddie had the judgment and capability to handle the increased responsibility. He spoke to Eddie as if he were already the kind of person who could be trusted with important tasks and who would naturally want to do excellent work. The transformation was remarkable. Within weeks, Eddie began arriving early for work, helping co-workers with problems, and taking initiative to improve processes in his department. He started dressing more professionally, speaking more thoughtfully in meetings, and taking pride in the quality of his work. When I asked my friend what had changed, Eddie said, "Mr. Johnson believes I'm leadership material, and I don't want to let him down. I never thought of myself that way before, but now I can see possibilities I hadn't considered." He had begun to see himself through my friend's eyes and was working to become the person he was expected to be. This principle works because it taps into one of our deepest psychological needs, the desire to be worthy of respect and admiration. When someone you respect sees positive qualities in you, you naturally want to live up to that vision. You begin to act in ways that are consistent with the reputation you've been given. I applied this same approach with my students, particularly those who came to my classes with poor self-concepts or histories of failure in communication. Instead of treating them as people who needed to overcome deficiencies, I treated them as natural communicators who simply needed to develop their existing talents. To a shy accountant, I might say, I can tell you're someone who thinks carefully before speaking, which is a wonderful quality in a presenter. Thoughtful people like you often become the most trusted and respected speakers because audiences can sense your sincerity and depth. To an aggressive salesman, I might say, your passion and energy are obvious strengths that can make you a very compelling speaker. People with your natural enthusiasm often become the most inspiring and motivational presenters once they learn to channel that energy effectively. In each case, I was identifying genuine qualities that could become strengths and speaking to the person as if those positive characteristics were already their defining features. This approach helped them see themselves in a new light and motivated them to develop in directions that matched my expectations. The most dramatic example of this principle occurred with a woman named Mrs. Thompson, who had been referred to my classes by her supervisor because of her communication problems. She was known for being argumentative, defensive, and difficult to work with in team situations. Instead of addressing her reputation for being difficult, I chose to focus on qualities that could serve her well if properly developed. "Mrs. Thompson," I said during our first private conversation, "it's clear that you care deeply about doing quality work and maintaining high standards. People with your attention to detail and commitment to excellence often become the most valuable team members because others know they can count on your thoroughness and integrity." I continued to reinforce this positive reputation throughout her time in the class. When she offered critical feedback to other students, I reframed it as evidence of her high standards and her investment in helping others succeed. When she questioned my teaching methods, I acknowledged her thoughtfulness and desire to understand concepts thoroughly. Gradually, Mrs. Thompson began to see herself as someone who cared about quality and helping others, rather than as someone who was just critical and difficult. She started offering constructive suggestions instead of negative criticism, supporting other students instead of competing with them, and approaching disagreements as opportunities for productive discussion rather than battles to be won. Her supervisor later told me that the change in Mrs. Thompson's workplace relationships had been dramatic. She had become one of their most collaborative and supportive team members, while maintaining her valuable attention to detail and high standards. The technique for applying this principle is to identify potential positive qualities in people and then speak to them as if those qualities were already their strongest characteristics. Look for evidence of traits like thoughtfulness, creativity, leadership, potential, integrity, persistence, or caring for others. Then use language that reinforces those positive identities. Someone with your natural leadership abilities, ... or people with your level of integrity, ... or given your obvious concern for quality, ... These phrases help people see themselves in positive terms and motivate them to live up to those characterizations. When someone makes a mistake or exhibits negative behavior, frame it as being inconsistent with their true character, rather than as evidence of their fundamental nature. "This doesn't seem like you. You're usually so thoughtful about how your decisions affect others." Or, "I know you care about doing quality work, so I'm sure you'll want to revisit this approach." This technique works particularly well with young people who are still forming their sense of identity. When you consistently treat a teenager as responsible, thoughtful, and capable, they often rise to meet those expectations. When you treat them as irresponsible and problematic, they frequently live down to those lower expectations. Remember, people generally become what you expect them to become. When you give others a fine reputation to live up to, you're not just being kind, you're actively helping them become the best version of themselves. This approach builds deep respect because it shows that you see potential and value in others that they may not have recognized in themselves. The reputation you give others often becomes the foundation for the respect they show you in return. When people know that you see them in positive terms and believe in their potential, they naturally want to earn and maintain your good opinion, creating relationships built on mutual respect and continued growth. When people feel that their mistakes are catastrophic or unforgivable, they become defensive, discouraged, and resistant to change. But when you help them understand that errors are simply learning opportunities that can be easily corrected, you create an environment where growth and improvement flourish naturally. I discovered this principle through my work with a talented but perfectionist student named Margaret, who was paralyzed by her fear of making mistakes during public speaking. She would spend weeks preparing for a 5-minute presentation, rehearsing every word and gesture until she had memorized the entire speech. Despite this preparation, she remained terrified that she would make an error that would embarrass her and prove she wasn't capable of effective communication. During one of her presentations, Margaret lost her place and stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, clearly mortified by her mistake. My first instinct was to reassure her that the error wasn't as bad as she thought, but I realized that approach would still reinforce the idea that mistakes were problems to be minimized rather than natural parts of the learning process. Instead, I said, "Margaret, what you just experienced happens to every speaker, including the most accomplished ones. The difference between good speakers and great speakers isn't that great speakers never lose. They're placits that they've learned to recover smoothly when it happens. Let me show you 3 simple techniques that will make handling these moments feel effortless." I then demonstrated how professional speakers handle forgotten lines, technical difficulties, and other common problems, making it clear that these challenges were normal and manageable rather than signs of failure. Margaret's relief was visible, and she began to see her mistake as a valuable learning opportunity rather than a personal failure. From that point forward, Margaret became much more relaxed and effective in her presentations. She stopped trying to achieve perfection and started focusing on communication and connection with her audience. Paradoxically, by accepting that mistakes were normal and correctable, she actually made fewer errors and delivered much more engaging presentations. This principle works because fear of making mistakes often creates the very problems we're trying to avoid. When people are terrified of errors, they become tense, overthink their actions, and lose the natural flow that leads to good performance. When they understand that mistakes are easily correctable, they relax and perform much more effectively. I applied this approach with great success in helping a small business owner named Robert who was struggling with employee training. His staff members were afraid to try new procedures or take initiative because they had learned that mistakes resulted in criticism and disappointment from management. I suggested that Robert change his approach to training by explicitly teaching his employees how to correct common errors rather than just how to avoid them. During training sessions, he would say things like, "When this situation occurs, and it will occur because it happens to everyone, here's the simple 3-step process for fixing it quickly and maintaining customer satisfaction." He also started sharing stories about his own mistakes and how he had learned from them, making it clear that errors were part of the normal business learning process rather than signs of incompetence. I made this same mistake during my first year in business, and here's what I learned about handling it effectively. The transformation in his workplace was remarkable. Employees became much more willing to try new approaches, ask questions when they were uncertain, and take initiative in solving problems. Customer service improved dramatically because staff members were focused on serving customers rather than avoiding mistakes. When someone does make an error, the key is to focus immediately on the solution rather than dwelling on the problem. Say things like, "These things happen, here's how we fix it," or "No worries. This is easily correctable. Let me show you the simple adjustment that will take care of it." Use language that normalizes the experience, Everyone goes through this when they're learning, or this is exactly the kind of situation that helps people become really good at this skill. Or I'm glad this happened during practice so we can work through it together. I learned to apply this principle in my personal relationships as well. When my wife made cooking mistakes while trying new recipes, instead of focusing on what went wrong, I would say, these experiments are how the best cooks develop their skills. What do you think we could adjust to make it even better next time? This approach kept her motivated to continue trying new things, rather than becoming discouraged by imperfect results. With children, this principle is especially important. When a child spills something or breaks something accidentally, responding with no problem. Accidents happen. Let's clean this up. Together teaches them that mistakes are manageable events, rather than catastrophes that make them bad people. The practical application involves several specific techniques. First, always address the solution before discussing the problem. When someone makes an error, immediately explain how to fix it, rather than analyzing why it went wrong. Second, use mistakes as teaching opportunities. This gives us a perfect chance to practice the recovery technique. Or now, you'll know exactly how to handle this situation if it ever happens again. Third, share your own similar experiences. I remember when I did something very similar, and here's what I learned from it. This normalizes their experience and shows that mistakes are part of everyone's learning journey. Fourth, emphasize the temporary nature of most mistakes. This is easily fixed, or a few simple adjustments will take care of this completely, or this type of problem usually resolves itself quickly once you know the right approach. When you consistently make others feel that their mistakes are easily correctable, you create an environment of psychological safety where people are willing to take risks, try new approaches, and stretch beyond their comfort zones. They know that if something goes wrong, you'll help them fix it rather than making them feel inadequate or foolish. This approach builds tremendous respect because it shows that you're more interested in helping people succeed than in maintaining your own superiority or avoiding inconvenience. People trust leaders and colleagues who make growth feel safe and achievable, and they respond with loyalty, effort, and continued improvement. Remember, everyone makes mistakes. It's an inevitable part of learning and growing. The difference between environments where people thrive and those where they merely survive is how mistakes are handled when they occur. When you master the art of making errors feel easily correctable, you become someone people want to work with, learn from, and emulate. The difference between commanding respect and demanding compliance is the difference between lasting influence and temporary submission. Those who rely on force, authority, or manipulation may achieve short-term cooperation, but they never earn the deep respect that leads to genuine loyalty and enthusiastic support. I learned this distinction through observing two very different managers at a company where I consulted on communication training. The first manager, Mr. Wilson, ruled through intimidation and rigid control. He demanded immediate compliance with his directives, criticized mistakes harshly, and used his position to force subordinates into submission. His department met basic productivity requirements, but barely. The second manager, Mrs. Anderson, led through influence and inspiration. She explained the reasoning behind decisions, asked for input from her team, and treated everyone with dignity regardless of their position in the hierarchy. Her department consistently exceeded expectations and had remarkably low turnover compared to other areas of the company. The crucial difference became clear when the company faced a crisis requiring extra effort from all employees. Mr. Wilson's team did exactly what was required and nothing more. Watching the clock and leaving promptly at quitting time, Mrs. Anderson's team stayed late voluntarily, contributed creative solutions to problems, and worked together with remarkable cooperation and energy. When I interviewed employees from both departments, the contrast was striking. Mr. Wilson's employees described him as the boss and spoke about him with resignation and subtle resentment. They followed his orders because they had to, not because they wanted to. Mrs. Anderson's employees described her as our leader and spoke about her with genuine respect and appreciation. They followed her guidance because they believed in her judgment and wanted to contribute to the team's success. The foundation of true influence is respect, and respect cannot be demanded or forced. It must be earned through consistent demonstration of character, competence, and care for others. When you try to command respect through position, threats, or manipulation, you create compliance without commitment, submission without loyalty. I saw this principle work powerfully in my own teaching evolution. In my early classes, I tried to establish authority by demonstrating my superior knowledge and experience. I would correct students immediately when they made errors, emphasize my credentials and accomplishments, and maintain strict control over classroom discussions. While students followed my instructions, I sensed an underlying resistance and distance. They learned the techniques I taught, but they didn't embrace them with enthusiasm or continued developing them after the class ended. I was getting compliance, but I wasn't creating the kind of transformational learning experience I hoped to provide. Everything changed when I shifted from trying to demonstrate my authority to earning my students' respect through genuine care for their success. Instead of emphasizing my superiority, I focused on understanding their challenges and helping them overcome obstacles. Instead of demanding compliance with my methods, I explained the reasoning behind techniques and invited them to adapt approaches to fit their individual styles and circumstances. The results were remarkable. Students became actively engaged rather than passively obedient. They asked deeper questions, practiced more diligently, and continued applying principles long after the formal training ended. Most importantly, they began recommending my classes to others because they felt genuinely helped rather than simply instructed. The key to building influence rather than relying on force is to make others feel that you're on their side, working toward their success rather than simply trying to get them to do what you want. This requires a fundamental shift in mindset from how can I get them to comply to how can I help them succeed. True influence begins with understanding what others genuinely want and need, then helping them achieve those goals in ways that also accomplish your objectives. When people feel that following your guidance serves their own interests and values, they don't resist, they cooperate enthusiastically. I learned to apply this principle by always beginning with others' goals and concerns rather than my own. Instead of saying, I need you to do this, I would say, based on what you've told me about your goals, I think this approach would help you achieve what you're looking for. When Mrs. Anderson needed her team to work overtime during the company crisis, she didn't simply announce the requirement. She explained how the extra effort would benefit the company's long-term stability, which would protect everyone's jobs and create opportunities for advancement. She made it clear that she was asking for their help in achieving something they all cared about rather than demanding compliance with her authority. The most sophisticated aspect of influence is that it makes others feel that they're choosing to follow your guidance rather than being forced to comply with your demands. When people feel they have choice and agency, they commit much more fully to the actions they take. This requires presenting ideas and suggestions in ways that allow others to reach their own conclusions rather than simply accepting your directives. Ask questions that help them think through situations. What do you think would happen if we tried this approach? How do you see this fitting with your long-term objectives? What concerns would you have about implementing this strategy? When people participate in developing solutions rather than simply receiving instructions, they take ownership of the outcomes. They become partners in achieving success rather than subordinates following orders. I also learned that influence requires consistency over time. People need to see that your guidance reliably leads to positive outcomes before they'll fully trust your judgment. This means being patient with the process and focusing on building long-term credibility rather than demanding immediate compliance. Share the reasoning behind your suggestions so others can evaluate the logic for themselves. I'm recommending this approach because my experience suggests it will help you avoid the most common pitfalls while maximizing your chances of success. This allows them to assess your advice rather than simply accepting it on faith. Acknowledge when your suggestions don't work out as expected, and help others learn from those experiences rather than trying to maintain an image of that didn't work as well as I expected. Let's figure out what we can learn from this and try a different approach. The respect that comes from influence rather than force is deep and lasting. When people choose to follow your guidance because they believe it serves their interests and because they trust your judgment, they become allies rather than reluctant subordinates. This approach requires more patience and skill than simply demanding compliance, but it creates relationships and results that are far more satisfying and sustainable. When you earn respect through influence, you build a network of people who genuinely want to help you succeed because they know you're committed to helping them succeed as well. Remember, anyone with sufficient authority can force temporary compliance, but only those who earn genuine respect can inspire lasting commitment and enthusiastic cooperation. The choice between force and influence is really a choice between short-term control and long-term leadership. The true test of these principles isn't whether you can apply them during important meetings or special occasions. It's whether you can live them consistently in your daily interactions with every person you encounter. The respect you earn isn't built through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of countless small moments where you choose to honor these timeless truths about human nature. I learned this lesson through years of observing the difference between people who achieved temporary success and those who built lasting respect and influence. The temporarily successful could turn on their charm when it served their purposes, but they reverted to selfish or disrespectful behavior when they thought it didn't matter. The truly respected individuals demonstrated these principles consistently, whether they were speaking with company presidents or janitors, whether they were having good days or struggling with personal challenges. Let me share how I developed my own system for daily practice, because I discovered that good intentions alone weren't sufficient. Like most people, I found it easy to be considerate and respectful when I was well rested, unstressed, and dealing with pleasant people. The real challenge came during difficult days, when I was under pressure, or when I encountered people who seemed unworthy of special consideration. I started each morning by reviewing 3 specific principles I would focus on that day. Monday might be genuine interest in others, Tuesday might be letting others save face, and Wednesday might be praising every improvement. This focused approach prevented me from trying to remember everything at once, while ensuring that I practiced each principle regularly. Before important interactions, meetings, phone calls, even casual conversations, I would take a moment to remind myself of my intention to apply these principles. How can I make this person feel important? What can I genuinely appreciate about them? How can I show sincere interest in their perspective? This brief mental preparation made an enormous difference in the quality of my interactions. I also developed the habit of reflecting each evening on how well I had applied these principles throughout the day. Not to criticize myself for failures, but to learn from both my successes and my mistakes. When an interaction went particularly well, I would identify which principles had contributed to that success. When an interaction went poorly, I would consider how these principles might have improved the outcome. One of my most valuable discoveries was that these principles become easier and more natural with practice. Initially, remembering to ask questions instead of giving orders required conscious effort and felt somewhat artificial. But after weeks of deliberate practice, this approach became my natural response to leadership situations. The principles gradually shifted from techniques I applied to qualities that became part of my character. I learned to start small and build consistency rather than trying to transform all my relationships overnight. I began by applying these principles with my family, where the relationships were strong enough to handle my imperfect attempts at change. Once I became more skilled and consistent at home, I extended the practices to my work relationships, then to casual acquaintances and strangers. The compound effect of daily practice was remarkable. Small improvements in individual interactions accumulated into significant changes in my overall relationships and reputation. People began seeking my advice more frequently, recommending me for opportunities, and including me in important discussions. More importantly, my relationships became more satisfying and meaningful. I discovered that consistency matters more than perfection. People notice and appreciate sustained effort to treat them well, even when your attempts aren't flawlessly executed. They respect the intention behind your actions and respond positively to your obvious care for their feelings and dignity. One of the most challenging aspects of daily practice is maintaining these principles under pressure or when dealing with difficult people. It's easy to show genuine interest when someone is pleasant and cooperative. It's much harder when they're hostile or demanding. But these challenging situations are actually where these principles prove most valuable. When someone is being unreasonable or disrespectful, your natural instinct is to respond in kind. But if you can maintain your commitment to treating them with dignity, finding something to appreciate, asking questions instead of making demands, letting them save face, you often transform the entire dynamic of the interaction. I remember a particularly difficult customer who called to complain angrily about our service. My initial impulse was to defend our company and point out where his expectations were unreasonable. Instead, I applied the principle of sincere interest in his perspective. I asked questions to understand his frustration, acknowledged the validity of his concerns, and worked collaboratively to find solutions. By the end of the conversation, he had become one of our most enthusiastic advocates. He later said that my respectful handling of his complaint had convinced him that our company truly cared about customer satisfaction. That single interaction, handled according to these principles, led to years of loyal business and numerous referrals. The key to sustainable daily practice is to focus on your own behavior, rather than trying to control others' responses. You can't guarantee that everyone will react positively to your respectful treatment, but you can guarantee that you'll conduct yourself with integrity and dignity regardless of how others behave. Developed several practical habits that supported consistent application of these principles. I started carrying a small notebook where I recorded people's names, interests, and personal details, which helped me remember to ask about their families, hobbies, and concerns during future conversations. I made it a practice to send brief notes of appreciation when people did good work or showed kindness. These notes took only minutes to write, but had lasting impact on my relationships with colleagues, employees, and business partners. I also learned to apologize quickly when I failed to live up to these principles. When I caught myself being impatient, critical, or dismissive, I would acknowledge my behavior and make amends. This honesty about my own imperfections actually strengthened rather than weakened the respect others had for me. The ultimate goal isn't to become perfect at applying these principles. It's to become the kind of person who naturally treats others with respect, dignity, and genuine care. This transformation happens gradually through consistent daily practice, until respectful behavior becomes as natural as breathing. As I look back on my decades of teaching and studying human relations, I'm convinced that these principles represent fundamental truths about human nature that will never become obsolete. Technology may change how we communicate, but the basic human needs for appreciation, respect, and dignity remain constant. The person who masters these principles in their daily life earns something more valuable than temporary success or fleeting popularity. They earn the deep, lasting respect that comes from consistently honoring the best in human nature. They become someone others trust, admire, and want to emulate. Most importantly, living these principles daily doesn't just change how others treat you, it changes who you become. You develop into a person of genuine character, someone whose respect for others reflects a deep understanding of what makes life meaningful and relationships satisfying. The choice is before you now. You can continue treating these insights as interesting ideas to consider occasionally, or you can commit to the daily practice that will transform both your relationships and your character. The principles are simple, but their consistent application requires dedication and persistence. I challenge you to begin today. Choose one principle from what I've shared and commit to practicing it in every interaction for the next week. Notice how people respond differently to you, but more importantly, notice how this practice begins to change your own perspective on relationships and human nature. The respect you seek from others begins with the respect you show to everyone you meet. Make that your daily practice, and you'll discover that earning respect isn't a technique you apply, it's a way of life you choose to live.